Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston. I'm your host today, and we're recording on the Friday afternoon, a couple of days after Manchester United defeated West Ham 3-1 in the FA Cup. So quadruple talk is still on, and it looks like 4 trophies are going to come to Old Trafford. Isn't that right, Samuel?
I wouldn't go that far just yet. I'm still nowhere near confident of that. But in the words of James Allen Robson, as we were leaving the press room the other night, United are back, aren't they? And I think they are just about at that point where we can say they are back.
Samuel has goaded me for about 5 days now, obviously since that Carabao Cup game.
Completely untrue.
I made the trip down to London, but it was obviously a joyless visit. Ty, you were obviously in the capital along with Samuel. It's nice to be back on the podcast with you both. How are you?
Yes, I'm good. Thank you, Stephen. Good. Enjoying the busy schedule at the moment. It is turning into quite the season, as Samuel alluded to there, and as James Robson suggested, it does feel like good times are coming back at the moment.
It's football at the moment. It's just not stopping, and it's going well if you're a United supporter because they just keep winning no matter what the game, and that's what it felt like, didn't it, Samuel? On Wednesday, obviously you both were at Old Trafford in the press box as usual, and a poor performance in the first half, 0-0 at the break. West Ham get the goal, and you think the quadruple's going to go. West Ham are going to win, but Ten Hag obviously made a few changes, and it seems to be that winning mentality, does it? That no matter what happens in a game, they just kind of come back from it and respond to setbacks.
Well, it was another colleague, Ty, who said about 4 minutes before Garnacho scored, he said to me, "There's an inevitability that they're going to score here," and of course that's what they did. They got a couple of goals, and at the moment, whether United aren't playing particularly well, I think their last really properly good performance, not necessarily from start to finish, but overall as an impressive package, was the Camp Nou, where they came away from it feeling disappointed not to have won that game, and rightly so. They've had some miffy performances since, yet they've won all 4 of them: Leicester, Barcelona, Newcastle, West Ham, 4 different competitions, 2 of their biggest games of the season, certainly in the Barcelona and Newcastle games. They've got a trophy in the cabinet again, and the belief is just coursing around the club at the moment, and it's palpable. It doesn't feel like it's temporary. We go back, just look at Instagram and the memory reminders you get of what was going on 4 years ago. We were just about to fly off to Paris for the PSG game, and of course that was a remarkable night, but it was temporary, and that was the night Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's tenure to some degree did peak. That remarkable comeback of going through on the away goals rule and the manner of it as well, and of course that ensured that he got the job on a permanent basis. But look how that season ended. It was a disaster. We didn't think it could get much worse than that 4-0 defeat at Everton on Easter Sunday, but then lo and behold, a few Aprils later, back in Merseyside, they get thumped 4-0 again by a different Liverpudlian side, and it was a hell of a lot worse under Ralf Rangnick. But where they've got a manager who's just switched on at just about every level, it feels like, and even on a night where he's making quite a lot of incorrect calls, and he did do that against West Ham, he's still getting more right. I thought the issue against West Ham was that, we do our panel team, and I had Martinez starting in mine, and he's such a key component of that secure square, if you like, in the 2 midfielders needed to change. I had no issue with that. They needed some freshness in there. By all means, preserve Varane for the Liverpool game. But Martinez is a durable defender, and it struck me as a little bit odd that he would be rested as well. And also where he's left-footed, it opens up different avenues. It's better for the balance. Ten Hag is such a stickler for right-footed and left-footed centre-backs that it does feel somewhat out of kilter with the way that United play when he does abandon that. And of course he did with Maguire and Lindelof, and they did not play well alongside each other. You look at the manner of how Antonio got through for the one-on-one with David De Gea in the first half. Normally you want your centre-backs to be parallel somewhat, but they weren't whatsoever. The defensive line, there was no defensive line. It seemed like they were separate from everybody else on the pitch, and one was deep, one was high up. And of course, it was Lindelof who came off in the second half. It could easily have been Maguire at that point. But once they had the regulars back in the team, and credit to Ten Hag, he took McTominay off, and McTominay did reasonably well at the start, but then he showed why he's a squad player, why he's pretty much been found out United this season, attempting passes that Casemiro can complete routinely and that are just beyond McTominay. He takes him out of the team. Casemiro comes on. West Ham still scored, and I think yesteryear when United got that goal that was chalked off, rightly so, for offside from Casemiro, that can be a death knell, really. It came on in the last 15 or 20 minutes, and that can easily deflate a team. But with this team, it's very different. They scored a few minutes later on. They're far more resilient. They have, as I said, they just have so much belief coursing around that dressing room at the moment, and that starts with the manager. I think it's fair to say he's an elite coach. He's proved that in a very short period of time. But it's also the small adjustments he makes in game, and he's been doing that a hell of a lot recently, intervening to ensure that Manchester United win football matches.
Victor Lindelof and Harry Maguire was a bit of a throwback, wasn't it? And probably an unwelcome one for the thousands inside Old Trafford when they've watched Varane and Martinez all season. Ty, do you think it's a fair statement to say they probably would have lost that game last season? And also, let's talk about Garnacho a bit, because he scored that goal. And I feel like the criticism of Garnacho, if there has been some, is that he's not sustained a performance for 90 minutes, and he can come into games and be an impact sub, but he's perhaps not done it from the start. So to stay on the pitch, to survive the changes, to be proactive and bright, and then to score the goal in the last minute, that was a huge, huge positive, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. I mean, going back to your first point, I guess, yes, they probably would have lost the game just because they didn't have that squad depth. And you mentioned Lindelof and Maguire being a bit of a throwback. If you consider kind of the defensive access of the team being those two in the holding midfield, and then having McTominay there made it a real throwback with those three. And I think what they missed most of all is they didn't defend particularly badly a lot, but what they missed was that ability to progress the ball and move it forwards. And first half as well, late on in the first half, you could tell it was the edgiest Old Trafford had been all season, I would say, because they just couldn't move the ball forward. And it was, Lindelof taking goal kicks, nudging it to De Gea, to Maguire, to Lindelof, to De Gea, and Lindelof and Maguire and McTominay just couldn't find those penetrative forward passes that Casemiro and Martinez do. And that's been a big feature of United's play this year, that they've, to use a tactical term, those two especially break the lines, and they find passes that can take 3 or 4 players out of a game and put United on the attack. And the players who played on Wednesday couldn't, and I thought that was a major miss for them. And in terms of Garnacho, it felt telling that Anthony was the player to go off rather than Garnacho. I did wonder at the time if it was. I thought Anthony's reaction to the goal was really poor, to be honest. I mean, there was a few players who were culpable there for just presuming the throw-in was going to be given and stopping. But I think Casemiro and Dalot were also on the scene, and they stopped initially and then kind of reacted. Anthony just gave up. He just completely stopped moving. And Benrahma was maybe a yard away from him when he started his run, and Anthony just gave up. Basically, he just thought that's a throw-in, and even when they played on, he just stopped, presuming it was going to be irrelevant. And Benrahma wouldn't have necessarily been his man, but he could have still influenced play. And I thought it was a poor look that he did just give up, and he came off soon after that. I think Garnacho was having the better game anyway, but you wonder if there was any relevance to that with Ten Hag's substitution. The thing that struck me most about Garnacho was his end product decision making is still a little bit iffy, but I thought his work rate was absolutely incredible on Wednesday night, defensively, especially first half, getting back and tracking Fornals. There was time he was the deepest player in that squad, in that team, and really putting the work in to track back and get back with his defenders. And that was a noticeable kind of improvement in his game. So he did deserve that goal. He had some excellent moments, but it was a much better all-round performance from him as well.
I mean, we've all played football to varying degrees of success, I think it's fair to say. But the first rule that you're told as a kid is play to the whistle. And it was very, very silly, wasn't it, when you saw a few of those heads be slow to react to that ball on the line. If we just discuss a bit more about Garnacho then, Samuel, because I think that was a really good performance from him, and obviously a great finish. He got the goal. Where could you see his career develop now? Because he is a natural left-sided forward. Marcus Rashford obviously plays on that side. he's having the best career of his life, the best season of his career. So where do you see Garnacho maybe playing? Is he going to be Rashford's understudy, as simple as that? Or do you feel he could force himself into a starting position? But where would that be if you try to get what I'm saying?
I think he's got options aplenty there. You look at Foden at City, and there's been such competition since he got into the team 6-7 years ago that he's maybe, there've been so many times where he's not been a regular, and certainly he's tailed off since the World Cup, but you always know that he's going to be an integral part of what City wants to achieve going forward. And sometimes, I mean, it's going to matter to the players because they're never going to be happy sat on the bench, but sometimes it's in the best interest of the squad that you've got them there. They're ever present. Garnacho this weekend, I don't imagine he'll start at Liverpool, and I don't imagine there'll be any right-minded United supporter who thinks that's the wrong call, because you want Marcus Rashford going up against Trent Alexander-Arnold. Rashford is, as you say, he's in career best form, and their most meaningful wins against Liverpool in the last 5 years have been through targeting Alexander-Arnold, and Rashford got the winners in both of those games, the most recent one in August. So I think the string that Garnacho needs to add to his bow, and I mean there are a few still, he's only 18, but I'd like to see him play a little bit more on the right. Ten Hag has been reluctant to do that. There have been games where he started Garnacho and Rashford, and you think, well, Garnacho's got to be the one who's on the right, because Rashford is Rashford, really, the way he's playing at the moment, but he hasn't. It's been Garnacho on the left, and Rashford's had to switch over to that side, and maybe that's Ten Hag's way of entrusting the more experienced players and allowing a younger player like Garnacho to get some consistency in that role, and maybe somewhere later along the line he will play more regularly on the right should those opportunities arise. But at the moment, the sky's the limit for him because, as I said, he's only 18. Ten Hag said a few weeks ago he didn't anticipate Garnacho's development to be this swift. And you look at the first couple of months of the season, he barely had a kick. I don't think he actually played, did he, until would it have been the Ammonia Nicosia
late
game?
October.
Was it? No, it was FC Sheriff. Sorry, I think he started that game because of obviously the issue with his timekeeping on the pre-season tour, and we obviously saw him, Stephen, when he did very well against Rayo Vallecano in the pre-season friendly. But how often does a youngster do well in a pre-season friendly, and then you don't hear or see any of them for the rest of the actual competitive season? So there was an element of patience there, and I thought it was. Again, Ten Hag has this knack for really chiming with supporters and echoing what supporters think, or even echoing what us guys in the press box think and what we're writing. And what he said the other night about Garnacho, he told him before the game, you've got to have an impact as a starter, was absolutely right. There hadn't been a domestic game yet where Garnacho had really, truly flourished from as a starter. He'd done it a couple of times in Europe, but again, the Europa League group stage, pretty much anyone, if you're an academy player at Man United, there's almost an expectation that you should be performing in a Europa League group stage game. Although when Garnacho did score against Real Sociedad, it was in by far and away the biggest game of that group, and it was against a good team with pretty good pedigree who actually topped it. And so it was, I mean, I think Ten Hag said himself, it was a step forward the other night in that he was coming up against a decent Premier League team. I still think that West Ham's place in the table isn't quite an accurate reflection of the quality in their squad. And he's ended up deciding the match. And like Ty said as well that, I think he just said it just then, but he also said it while we were in the press room afterwards. It was his running, tracking back that was another really progressive step, because that time when Mourinho berated Eden Hazard for not tracking back, and there were a lot of sniffy comments about it, you don't get that anymore because it's a prerequisite for pretty much any elite winger. If you're going to be a brilliant attacking asset, fair enough, but you're also going to have to put a shift in helping out your fullback, and the failure of the wingers to help out United's fullbacks ended up in them getting whipped 6-3 by City earlier in the season. So I think it's not just Garnacho who's learnt from that game, and he was merely an observer that day.
It's interesting when you look back at the pre-season tour. Obviously, you were both out there in Thailand and Australia, and Garnacho was the only outfield player not to get a single minute, wasn't he? And we were all a bit confused at the time with players like Chong, who's now at Birmingham playing, but obviously his attitude wasn't the best. So hopefully that's behind him now and onwards and upwards, and he can progress. I think we'll just leave it there for part one. We'll be back in a moment. So Tyrone, to begin part two, I wanted to ask you about Marcel Sabitzer and about Weghorst, who obviously both started on Wednesday night. Now, they're both on loan, both signed in January from Bayern Munich and Burnley. And we've probably had enough time now to give our opinion on the players. They've both played enough football. Ten Hag said the other day it's probably too early to say whether you would sign them, but I'm going to ask you that exact question and say, Tyrone, would you sign them at this stage?
Not at the moment, not at this stage. I thought Sabitzer had a pretty good game, certainly a good start on Wednesday night. I thought Weghorst had a good game too. His link-up play was really, really good. His issue remains putting the ball in the back of the net. I think he was delighted to see the offside flag when he missed that chance, and a return of one goal in 13 consecutive starts now is clearly not good enough for a striker. I think, there is kind of this growing chorus of people saying they've been great, let's sign them, they're good squad players. But I think it maybe puts too much focus on how good they actually are. I think what it shows is how easy it is to play well when you come into a team with structure and into a dressing room that is welcoming and has got a good team spirit and is going in the right direction. If United had signed Weghorst and Sabitzer on loan last January, let's just say that by March, I don't think people would have wanted them signed permanently because they would have found it an awful lot harder. It's just that they've arrived at the right time, in the right environment, under the right manager, and have been able to show how good they are. But there's an awful lot of players at that level and maybe better around Europe. The Weghorst one, I think it depends what you do with Martial, whether you look to sell him this summer. If you do, you need two strikers. Maybe Weghorst is a cheaper plan B. Sabitzer, I think you would probably want a younger midfielder. That's the other kind of thing with these two. One's 28 and one's 30, and this is a squad that is, I don't want to say old, but there are some players in there. You look at Varane, Casemiro. There's players in there who are leaders in that squad and who are world class players, but who are nearer the end than the start. You also, in a way, you need to think about the next level and the next step. So I'm not sure signing a 28-year-old midfielder to be a squad player and a 30-year-old striker to be a squad player is necessarily the right way to go. And I think it just speaks volumes. Really, is they're clearly good players, of course they are. But I think they've come into a club that is very welcoming now, where the team spirit in the dressing room, as we've heard all season, is really good. And the structure on the pitch is simple to follow. Players know their jobs. They're getting detailed coaching. When you put a good player into that environment, of course they're going to look good. And like I say, had you done that 12 months ago and put them into a Ranić team in a dysfunctional dressing room, they wouldn't have looked as good. That's just the way it is, really. So I think they're both clearly options, but I think you'd look for a different profile, or maybe a different age profile, especially in midfield where. What's Fernandes now? 27, 28? Casemiro 30, Eriksen 31 maybe. I think you clearly want a younger midfielder there, especially to come in and kind of fill that age profile.
Fernandes is 28.
28. You start in midfield, if you put Eriksen there, it's 28, 30 and 31, I think. So, I don't really see the point in signing another squad player who's late 20s at the moment. I think you'd look for maybe a midfielder who's a bit younger, who can fill in that kind of spectrum of ages and experience, I guess.
Did anyone see Jurgen Klopp have a pop at the age of United midfielders earlier today?
That's kind of, I did. That's kind of why it was in my head then. Yeah. But, I mean, it is kind of the sarky thing that Klopp likes to say. But like I say, with some of those signings, you can see that Casemiro's brilliant. It could be brilliant for 5 or 6 years, who knows? But there is kind of the younger age of the spectrum in the squad that probably does need filling as well. But yeah, I saw it. That's why it was kind of in my head.
I thought it might have been, and obviously just because Fabinho's got posters of Casemiro on his wall, he was saying that probably, doesn't he? Really, because Casemiro's been.
I mean, Fabinho looks a lot older than Casemiro this season, and I think he's younger. So
legs have gone in that midfield, haven't they? I'm sure we'll get onto that. Obviously Sunday afternoon at Anfield. But we'll just carry on with this game for now, Samuel. I thought it was worth mentioning Dalot because I feel it might have been a surprise to start him at right back. Wan-Bissaka started both games against Barcelona, and I thought, to be fair to him, he was excellent. I'm not going to speak for both of you, but I think on this podcast, the general consensus might have been that Wan-Bissaka's days were numbered at the club, and an exit looked inevitable. But to his credit, he's fought back. He showed admirable character, and he's making a real go of it. And he's been impressive in the last few weeks, hasn't he? So, were you surprised that decision to start Dalot after that Carabao Cup final, particularly because Wan-Bissaka came on and Saint-Maximin was brilliant, wasn't he? He was dancing around Dalot, and Wan-Bissaka made a real difference when he entered that pitch at Wembley.
He did. We're now talking about a game that was played nearly a week ago. But
I wanted to talk about it in context towards towards Sunday, of course, because Liverpool's attackers, let's face it, they're objectively better than Newcastle's, and it's going to be a similar task. You're going to perhaps have 3 players of Saint-Maximin's quality. So I'd personally start Wan-Bissaka on Sunday, actually, and I don't know what you think about that.
I agree with that. I think, spoiler alert, but for our panel piece that goes out on Sunday morning, it looks like all 3 of us have picked Wan-Bissaka because he is the informed right back, despite not starting the last 2 games. I think he would have been probably in the predicted lineups for the Newcastle game and the West Ham game in midweek because of the circumstances going into both those matches. I thought he did pretty well against Barcelona in the second leg. A couple of colleagues said, it was the right time to take him off. He had to come off. They weren't as impressed, but I thought he was quite respectable, all things considered, that night. And there was a reason why he wasn't sold or loaned out in the summer. That was because United was so dreadful last season. He was so dreadful last season that nobody was going to pay a fee for him. And in the end, it's, well, if nobody's coming up with a good enough loan fee or nobody really wants him enough, you're stuck with him and you've not got the leverage to go out and get Serginho Dest or another right back. I mean, in the end, it's worked out pretty well for United because Dalot up until the World Cup was excellent, and unfortunately for him that injury against Morocco has really impacted his season because it meant he was out for a while. I think it was a hamstring injury. He came back in, he got injured pretty quickly after that. I think it was the Charlton game, he limped off in the first half, and Wan-Bissaka has had a couple of very good months, and Dalot, trying to simplify it, I suppose the best he's really mustered since he came back from Qatar has been a 6 out of 10 in a game. He's not looked like the force he was in the first few months of the season, which is a pity. And he was very good at the World Cup as well. He ousted João Cancelo from the Portugal team, and speaking to people who cover the Portugal national side, who live in Portugal or are Portuguese, they were of the opinion that Dalot should have been starting the World Cup. So his stock at the time of the World Cup was really high, and that injury, as I said, that he got against Morocco in the quarterfinals, it's had a adverse effect on his season. But he is getting games. He still just does not look to be at his optimum, and I think it's pretty clear from Ten Hag's perspective that Dalot, as the all-round package, he prefers him as a right back to Wan-Bissaka because he got that assist for Eriksen, was it against Burnley in the League Cup, but he's still not a completely modern right back. The reason why he came on against Newcastle was because Saint-Maximin, as you said, was causing Dalot a hell of untold strife, and United needed a very defensive head to counter him, and Wan-Bissaka was very good in that sense. He didn't really do a great deal going forward, but he has struck up a pretty good rapport with Antony, of all people, which is it's a very unlikely alliance. The right back who barely speaks, and the Brazilian who I don't think has spoken a word of English, but when you put them on the pitch together, and they seem to have a very good understanding, and they link up pretty well. So it would not necessarily surprise me if Dalot starts this weekend just on the strength of Ten Hag's trust in him and the credits he's banked there. But as I said, I have spoiled it, our own self-imposed embargo for 4:30 a.m. on Sunday morning. But I can see why. I can see why both of you have gone for Wan-Bissaka, because I've put Wan-Bissaka in my team. It's probably the only position that you could say is uncertain or contentious going into the Liverpool match.
It occurred to me the other day that I'd never actually heard Wan-Bissaka speak. Can either of you recall?
You probably never will.
Well, I did a quick Google search, you see, and I think the closest clip I could find was January 2021, I think. And then before that, it was his unveiling video. So I don't know if you
He spoke at St James's Park. I'm not goading you here, but he obviously did score a goal at St James's Park. What was it, 2.5 years ago?
I think.
And I think they spoke to him on the pitch after the game. So I think that might have been the only time. But yeah, even when Ty and others of us, other members of the Manchester press pack tried to speak to him in Perth, they were struggling to elicit any words from him, and that was with Manchester United staff actively encouraging him to talk. And back in those days, it was very rare for United staff to try and get a player to speak. They wanted Wan-Bissaka to speak, and it turned out he didn't want to speak.
I mean, don't get us wrong. I only speak to you two because I get paid to. I don't choose to. So maybe that's why Wan-Bissaka has taken the approach. Before we move on to Liverpool, Ty, let's just discuss Casemiro, because he came on at half time. We've obviously sang his praises all season. McTominay came off. He thought he'd scored with that header, obviously from the set piece. It was rightly ruled off for offside, but he's made such an impact this season. He comes on in games like that and he almost changes the course, changes the direction of what is happening. Me and Samuel talked about it the week before that, actually, before I was off, and we discussed the signing of the season, and I said, look, we talked about it, I think, around Christmas time. And I wanted to get your verdict, Ty, because me and Samuel had a polite disagreement, of course, and Samuel was leaning the way of Lissandro Martinez for being signing of the season, and I'll probably lean towards Casemiro. So where do you win in that debate, would you say?
I think they've both been exceptional signings. I think I would be leaning towards Casemiro now. The influence he's had just seems to be growing and growing, and he's been totally transformative in terms of how they can set that midfield up, playing with just one holding midfielder, the quality of his forward passing, but also just how good he is off the pitch, and everything you hear about him, his leadership skills, what it means to him. You see how much it meant to him on Sunday. He just looks, he is the one that has made the biggest difference on the pitch this season. I think he's been absolutely outstanding. I think there's an argument he's player of the year. It's certainly up there with Rashford for the two of them. Rashford's numbers are obviously gonna sway that, but I do think he's been that influential. It feels like he's the one that's raising the bar for this team. And on Wednesday night, someone said yesterday it was like sending Dad on to sort it all out, wasn't it? And he's become that kind of player. He is just the heartbeat of that team, and it's
did Phil come out of that?
No, it wasn't. No, it was Jonathan Norcroft that mentioned that. Yeah,
very good.
A good one. But he is, in a way, when you have a player that good, it sometimes creates a problem that the player beneath them isn't that good, and then you notice the drop off. And I don't want to be unfair on Scott McTominay, but I think he'd accept he's not quite in Casemiro's league, and there's probably a few other leagues between them as well. And when you take one out of the team, and you've had a team that's used to playing with Casemiro and pinging those fast 30-yard balls into feet, sweeping up play a lot, and just. He's just in the right position all the time. He's a great leader and he's a great player. But the problem is finding someone that can back him up and do that job. And it's not really McTominay's game. I think Samuel said on Wednesday that him and McTominay and Sabitzer were kind of working it out for themselves because they both like to push forward, whereas Casemiro does occasionally, but he's always there as the last man sweeping up that midfield, really. So it feels like that is maybe something they need to look at, signing a player who can be Casemiro light, if you like. But that's the way football and football fans work. That you get a brilliant player who's a complete game changer for the team, then you take him out and say, "Oh, we need a backup game changer." But it's not that simple, really. But it does show when he's not in the team that there is a drop off, and it's not just a drop off in that position. It's a drop off in the way the team plays as a whole.
That's 2-1, Samuel, and the Casemiro vote. So stay tuned for what Richard Gray thinks to make it a late equaliser, perhaps. That's all for part 2. We'll be back in a moment to look ahead to the game on Sunday. Now we'll start this section with a bit of a quiz question. I know how much you both love that. So United last won at Anfield in January 2016, gents. Wayne Rooney 1-0. How many goals have they scored at Anfield in the years following?
1.
Samuel's doing his sheer impression and holding his hand up. Well done, Samuel. You're correct. Bang on the money again. I can't catch you out.
Jesse Lingard in December 2018. Mourinho's last game.
Yeah.
One of these days I will find an answer that neither of you can provide. But Samuel, look, it's going to be a tough game. Liverpool have struggled this season, but they've started to pick up a little bit of form. There was obviously that onslaught, I guess, against Real Madrid the other week, which was pretty embarrassing after being 2-0 up. But they have made steady progression, I'd say, over the last few weeks anyways. Do you think, obviously, confidence is riding high in the United camp? They won 2-1 at Old Trafford earlier in the season. So what are your expectations for this game? Can United do the double over Liverpool this season? Because that would represent another milestone again, wouldn't it, I guess?
Well, I watched the Liverpool game against Newcastle with one eye on the League Cup final and thought Liverpool were very good. They, in some ways, Klopp may have been quite annoyed coming away from it that they didn't really put Newcastle to the sword, because they had a hatful of chances in the second half, and then they almost risked making it very awkward for themselves with, I think, the Callum Wilson chance in the last 10 minutes where he just didn't really strike the ball.
He really should have scored that.
And Alisson, it was a relatively routine stop for him. He, as you say, he should have scored. But they were very, very dominant with 11 men against 11 men. And then when Nick Pope was sent off, they always toyed with Liverpool at times, with Newcastle at times, and should have been a lot more clinical. But it does seem like things are starting to click for Liverpool, at least on a domestic level. And then, of course, they came up against Real Madrid, and I don't think anyone can really legislate for it. You can maybe just say, why play Joe Gomez, who just doesn't... I thought he was a decent defender before the bad injury he had. Since then, he just looks like a player who should not be anywhere near that Liverpool team. And of course, Klopp would rather play Konate, but Konate's had his injury issues this season. Van Dijk's lost form, so they're not as watertight a defence as they used to be. But looking at some of those goals they conceded against Real Madrid, the mind really did boggle. And as bad as it was for the equalising goal, where you look at the bad back pass from Gomez and it's easy to blame Gomez, there was a big, big gap for Alisson just to punt it clear and not even risk Vinicius Jr. getting a touch on it, and he gets a good enough connection with it that it goes in. You watch Alexander-Arnold's defending for the Militao header, and I've always been of the opinion that Alexander-Arnold cannot defend, but in that moment he refused to defend. He literally acknowledged his existence, and then he just didn't bother tracking him. And sometimes you just can't explain those defensive errors. But I think those results that they had last week against Real Madrid, and who was the weekend result they had as well?
2-0 against Wolves.
No, the one before it. I've had a mind blank all of a sudden. I
can't pull that from my mind, unfortunately, Samuel.
Crystal Palace.
That's a good
shout.
Palace, 0-0 Palace.
The Palace game. Yeah, the 0-0 Palace game, where I didn't think they played particularly well in that. So they've gone from playing very well against Newcastle to having a very good 20 minutes against Real Madrid, but getting wallops. And then the Palace game, it could have gone either way. Again, some really poor defensive errors. And in the end, you've got Jamie Redknapp suggesting that it's not necessarily a bad result for Liverpool. In the grand scheme of things, it may not be too costly, but it's quite the departure from this time last year, where they were formidable and borderline unbeatable. United were the first team, I think, to beat them in a domestic competition in the calendar year, and that was in August. But I suppose looking back to that game, when it was a remarkable night in a lot of ways, because going into it, you wondered whether this was a good time for United to be playing Liverpool, or, as most of us suspected, it was just a dreadful time to be playing them, because they'd just been walloped 4-0 by Brentford, and you had the fans mutineering and protesting. there was a lot of negativity around the club. In the end, they just channeled it into the most unexpected positive with that opening 20-minute burst where they blitzed Liverpool, and they managed to see it out and get a rather unlikely win. And that game has been pivotal in both clubs' seasons. It was such a premature stage of the season. I certainly didn't think it had a bearing on Liverpool's campaign. I would never have predicted that night that United would still finish above Liverpool. And we've all been expecting Liverpool to get back to their old selves, and they've trounced Bournemouth. I think Bournemouth was their next game, actually. After that United one, they trounced them 9-0. They trounced Rangers 7-1. They had a good win against City, a good win against Tottenham as well, but they just can't quite seem to shake it off, and their season's been peppered with these really disastrous results. This year alone, you've had the Brentford game, you've had the Wolves game, and of course the Real Madrid game, and we're only in March. So all I'd say is, I think, given how badly they performed prior to the Wolves game against Madrid and then the Palace game as well, I think that's probably just going to reinforce the focus, so that there's no way they're going to underperform as badly as they have done in some of the more recent games. And where United are renascent again, and where United are competing in a few competitions, and they're above Liverpool as well, I just think that's just going to reinforce Liverpool's focus enough that they will be a very, very difficult, a very tough nut to crack this weekend. United haven't won at Anfield we're talking about how many goals United could win by at Anfield. It's that positive for United, even though we risk getting ahead of ourselves. But if United prevail there, it's going to be a narrow victory. It's going to be a 1-goal win. I don't foresee United going there and winning by at least 2 clear goals. And I don't think that's happened for United at Anfield since 1997. But the fact that people are talking about United being in good shape to go to Anfield and win at Anfield is a sign of progress, because the only time in recent years where there's been similar chatter was probably January 2021, where United had that brief period where they were at the top of the table. And of course, you didn't have a crowd there. And we all know how misleading that season was for United. And once normality resumed the following season, things were back to normal, because United were dreadful again and Liverpool were formidable again.
You talked about that 2-1 win at Old Trafford in August. And I tell you what, lads, that MEN journalist who reported on the protest before that game, he's got a bright future, him. That was outstanding.
Intrepid stuff.
That'll go in the bio as well, Samuel. Fred, let's talk about Fred, Ty, because we talked about Dalot and Wan-Bissaka in regards to who might start on Sunday afternoon, and there's obviously a choice to make between them two. But I think if you look at Fred, and he's probably been the perfect foil to Casemiro in the last few weeks, and he's been energetic and his performances have been really good. I call him a bit of a mad player on the podcast the other week, and we've discussed it, I think, all at length. His inconsistency, he can produce great moments and then have bad moments, but it's an immense compliment to his performances that he's probably a certainty to start on Sunday. Obviously there is injuries, but he looks really comfortable in that midfield at the moment, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. I mean, I've been a little surprised that he hasn't played more with Casemiro, given how good their understanding has been for Brazil. I mean, Fred plays in that Brazil midfield an awful lot with Casemiro, and they clearly have a good relationship. Even recently, even a month ago, I've kind of had the impression that almost his face doesn't fit with Ten Hag for some reason, that he doesn't fancy him, because he's started him in the league very rarely, and until the injury crisis, he didn't seem to be getting the minutes that I had expected him to. I thought he would quite like him as a player, but does seem to be changing now. He's playing very well. Is that 5 goals now since the World Cup? On Wednesday night, I think it's 4 or 5.
Season. Yeah,
he's got 6 this season. Yeah. I think most have come since the World Cup.
Yeah.
So he's popping up with goals as well, and like you say, I think he is a certainty to start that game. I would have him starting ahead of Sabitzer for sure, and that understanding with Casemiro is probably going to be vital in midfield. You look at Liverpool, and that's an area where United should be dominant. Really, there's been plenty written this season about Liverpool's midfield issues. Even without Eriksen, you have Casemiro and Fernandes, and then throw Fred in, and that understanding and the energy Fred brings, and that's an area where United could really dominate at Anfield. So yeah, I would definitely have him in the starting 11. He's playing well at the moment. He's influencing games. like you said, a mad player is probably a good way of putting it. He can have games where it just looks like he's forgotten how to pass the ball. It's kind of an issue with him and McTominay at times, and that their radar can just be off. They just lack the, they're not quite at the elite world class level for passing. But I think that was always an issue with them playing alongside each other. Whereas if you've got Fred, say, alongside Casemiro, it's not as noticeable. If you've got someone else whose passing is brilliant, it was more of an issue when they played alongside each other. So yeah, I think playing very well at the moment. It's taken a while for him to kind of force his way into the team and into the picture a little bit more than you might have expected. But he's another example, and there's an awful lot of them. And it kind of goes back to what I said about Sabitzer and Weghorst, that players are now coming into this team and looking good. Wan-Bissaka's a great example, in that he was a write-off 3 months ago, and now I think you touched on it before, but I think he's arguably pushing Dalot now for a place. I think that's gone from being the one position in the squad with no competition to the position now with the most intense competition. So it just shows that when you have that structure, you can drop players in who might not have played as much as they want, but they can suddenly start thriving. And I think that's what's happening with Fred.
Just before we wrap up then, are we all looking forward to reporting on a historic quadruple then by the end of May, June time?
It's not it wouldn't be the quadruple though, would it? As one of our colleagues highlighted, there was a banner in the Stretford end about 20 years ago deriding Liverpool's Mickey Mouse treble of the FA Cup, League Cup, and the UEFA Cup, and obviously that's what United are aspiring to achieve, and also like then that ended a near 6 year trophy drought for Liverpool, so the parallels really do quite stack up there.
I mean, I can't even imagine what it's like to win a Carabao Cup. Never mind cups. So I'm not getting carried away.
The issue with the league title is that it was always a distant possibility anyway, but they could kick off on Sunday 14 points behind Arsenal, because I think Arsenal will have played 3 times since United last played in the league. And although that doesn't change, that hasn't really changed a lot. There's still games Arsenal could drop points in. Psychologically, being 14 points behind at this stage of the season, even with a couple of games in hand, one of which will obviously be at Liverpool, feels too big a gap, doesn't it? 14 points, even with those games in hand, that feels impossible.
There's a lack of momentum that they can generate. I think from when they played Leicester, fast forward 6 weeks to when they play Newcastle, they'll have played 2 league games in between, which are Liverpool and Southampton. So because of the cup commitments, getting to the League Cup final, getting to the FA Cup quarterfinals, that is killing their momentum on the league front. Not that I've ever, and a lot of people have ever really seen United as title challengers. If they finish third this season, that is a brilliant season for them as far as the league goes. This season seems all but certain to be a success. So in some ways, it does do them a bit of a favour, because when there was that title chatter in January after they beat City, the Palace game and the Arsenal game, it wasn't a coincidence they dropped points when there was a little bit of expectation on them.
I have tried to get Sam to entertain title talk, but it's just not worked. And
you'll learn, Stephen. You'll learn in time. You're still
He's been steadfast, to be fair to him.
I'll keep trying. Thank you very much for your time, Samuel.
Thank you, Stephen.
And thank you, Tyrone, as usual.
Cheers. Thanks, Stephen.
And thanks to listeners. Head over to the YouTube channel. Check her out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all your other audio platforms. Take care and have a great weekend.